right, hello everyone. Right. We will begin our presentation shortly. This session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes with about 45 minutes worth of presentation, followed by time for questions and answers. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation and turn off your cameras. If you have a question or comment, enter it in the chat during the presentation, and it will be addressed during the question and answer period. You may also verbally ask questions during the question and answer portion. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 week after the live event. My name is Dr. Catherine Showalter, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. TESOL International Association Speech Pronunciation and Listening Interest Section is pleased to present this webinar titled The Social Weighting of L2 Speech Input. Our speakers are Dr. Rachel Hayes-Harp, Professor of Linguistics at the University of Utah, Dr. Shannon Barrios, Assistant Professor of Linguistics at the University of Utah, and Dr. Alea Tripp, a President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Speech Language Hearing Science Department at the University of Minnesota. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar, and now I'll hand it over to our speakers.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. And thank you, Kate, for the lovely introduction. Our hosts, Kate and Josh, are old friends of ours, and it's so nice to see them and also to see so many other friends who are joining today. Just because we are proud mentors, we want to note that Kate is a former PhD student in our lab. And so it's always nice to connect with Kate again. I'm Rachel Hayes-Harp. I use she and her pronouns. And my colleague Shannon Barrios and I are coming to you from the University of Utah, which is located in so-called Salt Lake City, Utah, and on the unceded land of the Shoshone, Goshute, Paiute, and Ute people. I'll start with a visual description of myself. I'm a white woman in my 40s with gray hair worn down, and I'm seated with a bookshelf in my background.
And I'm Shannon Barrios. I also use she, her pronouns. I'm a female in my 30s. I have long blonde hair that's pulled back, and I'm seated in an office setting that's kind of blurred.
And I'm Alea Tripp. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a light-skinned Black person. I have my hair in locks, and it's in an asymmetrical style, so it's up on one side and down on the other. I'm at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, which was created and persists primarily through the ongoing theft of the homeland of the Dakota Oyate. And where I am right now is about 8 miles north of Bedote, the place where Hahawakpa and Minnesota Wakpa come together, which many Dakota people consider the sacred site of their people's creation. So you may know these as the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers.
We're really grateful for the invitation to talk today about our collaborative research program on the social weighting of input from various sources in adult phonetic learning. We want to point out that a preprint reporting one of the studies we'll talk about today, along with all study materials, data, and analysis code, are available via the link on this page, and also you can access it via the QR code if you'd like. We can also plunk that in the chat if it would be helpful. We want to start with some acknowledgements. We are grateful to the contributions of many people, including our hosts today, and also to speech acquisition lab members Katie Hunting, Joanne Moffett, 3 speakers of Hindi who produced the stimuli for one of the studies we'll talk about. Matt Wynn at University of Minnesota was very helpful in with some of our Pratt scripting. And we also want to acknowledge the contributions of people who have attended previous versions of this talk, including lab members, members of CLARG at the University of Utah, and audiences at PSLLT. And finally, of course, and importantly, the people who gave their time so that this research was possible. So we as scholars want to emphasize that we are ourselves learning about and also are committed to advocating for acknowledgements of how who we are and how our lived experiences shape the work we choose to do and how we do it. So I'd like to start by reading quickly this statement of our positionality as scholars. Rachel and Shannon are white L1 speakers of US English, and Alaya is a racialized L1 speaker of US English. All three of us have studied additional languages in the form of elite multilingualism, and Shannon and Rachel have experience as professional language teachers of English and Spanish, respectively. Listeners' assumptions about the relative value of input from teachers and from student peers is the phenomenon of interest in this research. As researchers, we're interested in these assumptions, and we conduct this research for investigating, not reinforcing or legitimizing them. So by way of introduction to this work, we'll start with some background information. We know that second language acquisition, or L2 acquisition, typically involves learning novel phonological contrasts. For example, English speakers who have the voiceless glottal fricative h need to learn to contrast glottal and pharyngeal voiceless fricatives in Arabic. And native speakers of Spanish, for example, which has the vowel e, must learn the Catalan e contrast when learning Catalan. But it also involves learning novel phonetics. So even though English and Spanish both nominally have T and D phonemes, these phonemes are produced on the alveolar ridge typically in English, but they're produced with a dental articulation in Spanish. And so this is a subphonemic difference between English and Spanish, for example. And another example, English stop voicing uses short lag and long lag distinction, whereas Spanish has a pre-voiced and short lag distinction. While we're primarily interested in the latter challenge, that is learning second language phonetics, it's useful to begin by talking about how input works. But first, we're going to cover a little bit more about how VOT operates.
Okay, so just to make really clear what voice onset time is here, we have a representation of the sound wave created by a production of the syllables B or P. So the place of articulation and the manner of articulation of these sounds are the same. What makes them different is the VOT or voice onset time, which is represented here by the black bar. So you can see the difference in the amplitude represented before and after the voicing after the voicing starts. Slide. This is an example of variation in VOT, which is phonemic, which means it makes a difference between hearing one word, say beer, and a completely different word, say peer. So there's a clear pattern of variation between the B's and the P's that we can categorically perceive. And this is just, this can be located in this timing relationship between when the lips open compared to when the larynx starts to vibrate.
All right. So of interest here then is the effect of variability in auditory input on second language speech learning. We're going to contextualize our work on voice onset time within some previous research now. So some of the input variability experienced by learners is actually associated with phonological contrast. So for example, the use of VOT to distinguish voicing in some languages. And we know that adult listeners can infer the phonological properties of an unfamiliar language from the statistical distributions of acoustic events. For example, English-speaking listeners are sensitive to systematic variation in voice onset time in their input. In fact, they can track voice onset time durations that are subphonemic in English, as shown in studies by May and Hayes-Harb, following a brief exposure to auditory events that are most frequently associated with either a short or a long VOT. That's the bimodal distribution illustrated on the left in the figure on this slide. Adult English speakers are more likely to perceive a contrast between a short lag and long lag VOT in a subsequent discrimination task. In contrast, when participants are exposed to a unimodal distribution, that's the one on the right, with most auditory events occurring towards the center of the VOT continuum, they're less likely afterwards to perceive such a VOT contrast. So this suggests an exquisite sensitivity by adult listeners to track the acoustic properties of their auditory input and to make inferences about the phonological structure of the target language from those properties. However, not all variability is contrastive in nature, as we know. This variability, that is phonetic variability, is referred to as non-contrastive, subphonemic, allophonic, or as we're going to refer to it typically, phonetic variability. It's associated with things like variation in speech rate, dialectal variation, differential articulation in different phonological contexts, and importantly for the present research, individual talker differences. So while it may seem to be an irrelevant source of variability in the speech signal, there's reason to believe that individual talker differences are detectable and learnable by listeners in a monolingual context. Indeed, subphonemic variation between talkers is a property of speech. An example provided by Alan Miller and Esteno demonstrates that native speakers of English show systematic subphonemic variability in VOT. This means that talkers have characteristic VOT, right? So like whatever it is about the talker's speech, it has some systematic VOT values. What's remarkable though is that listeners can actually track these characteristic VOTs of individual talkers. So Allen and Miller found that following an exposure phase where talkers differ in voiceless stop VOT durations, so different talkers had different VOT durations associated with their speech, adult listeners can actually select which of two voice onset times is more characteristic for a given talker. And so what this suggests is that listeners can track the VOT characteristics of an individual talker and then remember those, right? And then use that to do subsequent tasks. And there's reason to suspect that this may be adaptive in that it supports efficient processing of the speech signal. So our question here is whether the mechanisms that underlie this ability are available to adults learning new languages, and importantly, whether they can be leveraged to moderate the influence of different talkers on learners' acquisition of a new language's phonetics. But first, it's important to note that aspects of second language speech learning can be enhanced by non-contrastive variability in the speech signal. There's research on high variability phonetic training demonstrating that the variability that's associated with input from multi-talker input leads to more robust second language phonological categories than does input from a single talker. However, it's important to note that this may depend on individual learner characteristics, and so this isn't necessarily an across-the-board phenomenon. What's more, Samuel and Loraza have demonstrated that multilinguals in multilingual settings treat native and non-native pronunciations just as allophonic variation for the purpose of word recognition, which may, of course, be an efficient adaptation to their environment. However, it's important to note that these and similar studies have always been conducted in settings that were intended to be socially neutral. But we insist for the purpose of this research that we interrogate that assumption because input is never actually socially neutral for learners.
So because languages aren't actual, right, so when we learn about a language, what we're actually learning about is the behavior of other people who speak that language. So the present work contrasts predictions of asocial learning models, which suppose that listeners will treat all talkers identically, with the predictions of the affiliative model of language learning introduced in my dissertation. And so the affiliative model describes learners as using social comparisons to form their language preferences. So if learners are relying on social perception to guide their language learning, we should predict that their preferences for talkers with particular social affiliations, judged through assessments of accent or other socially evaluated features or behaviors, will govern their linguistic preferences and dispreferences. So the affiliative model predicts that learners will treat talker-specific phonetics differently, depending on their perception of the talker's membership in social groups. So It's been shown that depending on who you imagine the voice you're hearing belongs to, you can actually be induced to hear categorically different sounds. And there's lots of evidence for these effects. The first citation here is a review of the literature demonstrating effects of gender on speech perception. In order to explain these kinds of effects, there's so much evidence for them. In my dissertation work, I introduced the affiliative model of language learning, which attempts to explain how linguistic knowledge and sociolinguistic knowledge are related. Instead of describing perception as this asocial process, the model describes perception of sounds as being shaped by prior beliefs about the social group membership of the talker and the comparative reliability of different perceptible groups. So it could be that learners selectively curate whose evidence they rely on when learning a language. In a classroom environment, a salient group contrast could be teachers who are expected to be more reliably knowledgeable versus students who are expected to be less reliably knowledgeable about the content of the language, the form of the language. This is back to Rachel.
Forgive me. Yep. This brings us to the role that ideologies of accent play in the language classroom and how they interact with questions of authority and expertise assigned to the teacher role. In other words, in the language classroom, whose input do adult language learners believe is best? Some scholarship has reinforced an ideology of preference for nativeness in second language pronunciation, but this ideology has been challenged by others in favor of intelligibility as a goal for second language learners, though it's important to note that intelligibility is also not devoid of social influence and bias. Slide. And all of this leads to the question of whose input matters to second language learners. So we know that learners typically experience the speech of multiple talkers, and that in a language classroom, they're exposed to input from their teacher and likely also from student peers. So the question we're asking here is, in the absence of additional cues, do adult learners differentially learn the VOT, the voice onset time properties, of teachers and student peers in an artificial language learning setting? We should reiterate that listeners' assumptions about the relative value of input from teachers and fellow students is the phenomenon of interest. And of course, we as researchers are interested in these assumptions, and the act of doing this research is intended to problematize, not to reinforce assumptions about the relative value of speakers' speech. So to address this question, we take advantage of the well-studied dimension of voice onset time learning. English initial voiceless stop consonants are aspirated and exhibit a relatively long positive VOT. In the artificial target language we created for this study, voice onset time is synthetically manipulated such that sometimes it's very, very short and sometimes it's very, very long. The question is whether manipulating who produces the short versus the long voice onset times in this purported target language, that is, whether it's the teacher or the student, will differentially affect participants' later impressions of what the language should sound like.
So our participants in this study consisted of 264 individuals who identified English as a so-called native language and also a language that was spoken by parents and childhood caregivers. These participants were randomly assigned to one of 8 exposure conditions that crossed the teacher role, who the teacher was, talker 1 or talker 2, the VOT length that was associated with that teacher talker, and then exposure condition, whether or not participants were assigned to the control or the test conditions. The control conditions involved the 2 talkers, the teacher and the student talker, producing VOTs of the same length. So VOT didn't vary during exposure, and we anticipated that participants who are exposed to VOTs of kind of consistently the same length would prefer that length at test. The interesting conditions are the experimental conditions where VOT of the teacher and the student talker varied. So the teacher and student would produce VOTs of different length. And we're interested in which of those, when we have equal amounts of exposure, is preferred by the learner in that context. Our stimuli were 12 CV, consonant, vowel, non-words. 4 of them were PA initial, 4 were TA initial, and 4 KA initial. And they were produced by 3 female native English speakers. Talker 1 and Talker 2 were systematically assigned to either the teacher or the student role, and Talker 3 was always assigned to the student test talker role that we'll describe in just a second. VOT was manipulated such that long VOTs were always 125 milliseconds in length, and short VOTs were always 25 milliseconds in length. And then these auditory forms or auditory words were paired with pictured meanings that conveyed the meaning of the words that participants were learning in the study. Our participants were recruited through one of 2 recruitment platforms, either Sona or Prolific, and they completed the experiment online. From Sona or Prolific, they were first sent to a Qualtrics survey where they were presented the consent form and provided consent to participate. And then they were funneled into the online study, which was hosted on Pavlovia, built in PsychoPy and hosted on Pavlovia. And I'm going to give some details about those experimental procedures on the next slide, but they involve 2 exposure phases, each followed by a test phase. And following the experimental procedures, participants then completed a demographic and language background questionnaire that was, again, in Qualtrics. And overall, this entire procedure lasted about 20 minutes. So here I'm going to give you an example of kind of zoomed out example of what the experimental or test condition would look like in the case that the teacher talker is Talker 1 who produces long VOTs and the student talker is Talker 2 who produces short VOTs. So during the exposure phase, the participants heard the teacher produce 12 words in a random order, followed by the student. And this was repeated twice during exposure for a total of 48 trials. Each exposure phase was followed by a test phase, and that test phase and the cycle of exposure and test was repeated twice. Each test phase consisted of 12 2 alternative forced choice trials, 1 trial for each word. And on each trial, participants heard Talker 3 produce the word in question, once with a long VOT and once with a short VOT. And they had to decide which of the 2 productions they thought was best. Again, this exposure phase 1 was repeated by the same cycle. So we had the teacher talker produce, followed by student talker twice, followed by a test phase involving that 2 alternative forced choice. So we have created a quick demo to give you a sense of what this experience was like for our participants. So participants would see instructions like these ones, and they'd be told that they're going to observe a foreign language classroom where students are learning new vocabulary, and they will alternate from hearing the teacher say the new words and hearing the student practice those words. And their job is to learn as much as they can about how the language sounds. They don't necessarily need to learn the words, but they should pay attention to how they're pronounced. On a subsequent slide, they're given the important cues to who the talker is. So they're told that when they see the teacher highlighted in orange like this, they'll know that the teacher is talking. They'll know that the student is talking when the student is highlighted in orange like this. And now we're going to hear the student produce some of the teacher produce some of those words.
Tuli, Hule, Tefu.
Right. And after hearing the student produce the words, then they would go through a portion where after they hear the teacher say those words, they're going to hear the student pronounce those words.
Keto, Kina, Kinu.
Okay, so the participants hear each of the 12 words produced by the teacher and talker. We kind of shortened this for you for a total of 48 exposure trials. And then this is followed by a test phase. So during the test phase, they're cued into the student talker here. They're told that the student will be highlighted in blue when they're hearing the student produce. They're going to hear 2 different pronunciations on each trial, and their job is to determine which of the 2 pronunciations is better. If they prefer the first pronunciation, they should press the 1 key, and if they prefer the second pronunciation, they should press the 2 key.
Te,
And this was playing poorly earlier, so I'll see if I can get it to play full.
Fu, Teifu. Teifu. Teifu.
I don't know why those were hesitating earlier, but they hear two pronunciations of these words by the student talker. And then they would go through the exposure phase again, followed by the test phase again to produce the results for this study. So our data consisted of, from those 264 participants, 6,336 observations. The first thing that we did with that data is exclude any responses that exceeded 4 seconds, and this amounted to 452 of those observations, or 7% of the data. Then we converted 1 and 2 key responses to long responses. So 1 corresponded to a long response and 0 corresponded to a short response, so that we could compute mean proportion long responses from the data. So we computed mean proportion long responses for the control and experimental conditions, for the teacher talker length, and for the test 1 and 2. Here's a box plot of the results with black dots representing individual participant means. The top panel here corresponds to test 1 and the bottom to test 2. The vertical axis is mean proportion long responses. And this corresponds to the proportion of the time that participants selected the long VOT as the one that sounded more natural to them in the target language. And then across the bottom, we have the exposure conditions. Starting with control long, where both the teacher and the student produced long VOTs. Control short, where the teacher and the student both produced short VOTs. Teacher long, where teacher produced long VOTs and the student produced short VOTs. And teacher short, where the teacher produced short VOTs and the student produced long ones. And we present this data here so that you can see the variability that's exhibited by the participants. So this figure represents the same data and under the same organization, but in a bar graph form, and our statistical analyses in their completeness are on the right in summary. I'm going to focus on the important details of those analyses, looking first at the control condition. So for the control conditions, what we expected is that participants should prefer the VOT that they heard during exposure. And so we should see a preference for the long VOT when the productions of the teacher and the student are long, and we should see a preference for the short VOT when the productions of the teacher and student are short. And that should produce a difference between the control long and the control short performance. And this is what we see. We see that effect, this difference between the two exposure conditions at time 1 and at time paying attention to these VOTs, but it isn't actually the detail that we're most interested in. The question of primary interest is what happens when the participants are exposed to both short and long VOTs in equal numbers, but that these productions are associated with different talkers. So if the teacher's productions have a greater influence on the listener's impressions of the way the language should sound, then we expect exactly what we see at test 2 here for the 2 test conditions, where participants select the long response when the teacher produces the long VOTs and prefers the short VOTs, or provides more fewer long responses when the teacher is producing short VOTs. It's worth noting that there was no difference in performance between the 2 experimental conditions at test 1. So we didn't observe this effect here. And this might have to do with participants needing more exposure in order to kind of pick up on the difference and track these VOT durations. Okay, so in this study, what we've seen so far, we asked whether adult learners prefer the phonetics of the teacher relative to those of a student in this artificial language learning setting. The answer to this question appears to be yes, despite identical auditory input in the two experimental exposure conditions. Participants showed a preference for VOT that was associated with the teacher talker. A preference for long VOTs when the teacher produced long VOTs and vice versa. And we see this at test 2. This suggests that adult learners are sensitive to subphonemic variation and importantly to who is producing it. However, the effect that we observe is quite small, and our materials were produced such that they were English-like in other respects. And so we wanted to see how this effect would change when the words produced sounded less like English. We're interested particularly in whether or not this produces a more robust effect. So we conducted another study. In study 2, we examined whether these effects are replicated with a second set of Hindi-like materials. The stimuli for the second study consisted of 5 Hindi-like words with word initial voiceless aspirated retroflex stops produced by 3 Hindi speakers. As before, we manipulated VOT length of the word initial stop such that it was either long or short. And our secondary motivation here was whether the stimuli elicited larger effects of VOT length. Again, our initial experiment had relatively low power and required an awful lot of participants in order to observe a significant effect. So we're interested in whether or not the pattern here will be more robust. Our participants in this study are 64 folks who met the same demographic criteria that we mentioned before. 27 of them were assigned to the test condition in which the teacher talker was assigned the teacher role and produced long VOTs, and the student produced short VOTs. 30 of them were assigned to the condition where the teacher talker was talker 1 and produced short VOTs, and so on. We applied the same treatment to the data that was collected here. So again, I'm showing you a box plot that is very similar to the one that you saw for study 1, with the 2 test conditions broken down by teacher talker and test number. Again, the points here are individual participant means, so means of long responses. And again, you see numerically more responses when the teacher produced long VOTs and fewer when the teacher produced short VOTs, but again, quite a bit of variation within individuals. Here's the bar graph form of this. Our pairwise comparisons, as before, show significant simple effects of exposure condition at test 2. In addition, in this study, we observed that at test 1. This pattern is almost identical to what we saw in the previous study. So we're not observing that boost in power with these Hindi-like stimuli, which to consider means for increasing power, stimuli involving more salient contrasts, for example, and including other measures that can be used as covariates in our statistical analyses. So this is the route that we went with an additional study to be able to explore, and this will allow us to explore lots of other interesting questions. So again, the study 2 here provides additional evidence that adults are sensitive to subphonemic variation, and importantly, who is producing it. However, the effect is still quite small. So we thought perhaps we could increase the effect size by making the variation that the learners are trying to pick up on more salient. And rather than using subphonemic variation, we look at a contrast that's phonemic in English. So in an ongoing follow-up, study 3 here, we examine whether these effects are replicated within a third set of stimuli. The stimuli in the third set are 24 CVC non-words. 12 of them have sa initially, so sego, and 12 of them would have a za initial like zego. They're produced by 3 female talkers. Rather than manipulate VOT, we chose to focus on this word initial distinction in voicing that should be salient to our English listeners. So the difference between sa and za. And our motivation here is to see whether or not these stimuli elicit a larger effect. So far, we have only 34 participants here, and they're distributed across those 4 test conditions. But we want to show you the data that we're observing in this case. So here you can see the box plot. Now I'm showing you mean proportion Z responses as a function of exposure condition and broken down by teacher talker and test talker. As before, the dots are individual participant means. Again, you can see numerically more Z responses when the teacher produces Z and fewer when the teacher produces SA. When I show you this data in a bar graph, I hope what stands out to you is that we are observing that same pattern that we have observed before, but the pattern is much more dramatic. This is the type of effect that we were hoping to be able to elicit so that we can follow up on this data. So this data suggests that the patterns observed in the first 2 experiments are indeed replicable. And here we see this really pronounced pattern that we're now going to be able to try to interrogate some more. Sorry, Eli, you have to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay. So the results of all of these experiments together demonstrate that what learners believe about the social relationships of talkers affects their judgments about speech. So first we tested subphonemic contrasts, those which don't categorically distinguish between speech segments in English, and we found an effect there. But ultimately we found this effect is a whole lot bigger when we use a phonemic contrast, that is speech sounds which are categorically different for our listeners, which distinguish between different words. So although these studies focus on the impact of social assessment on adults learning in a classroom environment, these findings could be broadly relevant to learning at different ages and in different environments. So our study isn't without limitations. For one, we didn't introduce any variation in VOT within talker. So with respect to VOT, the input was there were short VOTs and long VOTs, but any given talker didn't produce a range, unlike in real life. So nevertheless, our findings suggest that we could further interrogate this effect by looking at other sources of information that listeners might use to make inferences about talkers and the value of the input that they provide. So for example, from the work of Donald Rubin and Okim Kang, we know that listeners' comprehension of speech is impacted by perceptions of race and ethnicity. So we could use pictures to provide additional visual cues to the social characteristics of the teachers and fellow students. But the question is how biases could play out in affecting the effect, in influencing the effect that we've observed here, where learners prefer the input of the talkers. And we could also examine types of interactions. So like how could the input from the teacher be manipulated to seem like perhaps it's more corrective or pedagogical than it is by default. In any case, it's clear that there's a lot of work left to be done in determining not just how input affects L2 learning, but how social factors interact with the input to shape learners' evolving L2 grammars. So for next steps, we hope to extend this line of research with more experiments manipulating the social characterization of the teacher, asking how is the preference for teacher input impacted if we lead the listener to believe different things about them, such as how they've been evaluated as a teacher, how are they racialized, how old are they, etc. And we've applied for a Spencer Foundation grant to support this continued research. So this research program has implications for models of social and linguistic perception, as well as our understanding of linguistic discrimination and its impact on language teaching and learning. And this work is foundational to identifying how social orientation impacts linguistic perception and learning. So it also has potential educational applications in that as we increase our awareness of linguistic diversity and its significance to learners, We also need to increase our ability to appropriately identify how those differences in linguistic and social backgrounds can shape learners' sociolinguistic perspectives and therefore contribute to differences in their learning processes and in their learning outcomes. This work could also provide the basis for developing tests of psycholinguistic bias and potentially open some avenues of investigation into possible factors underlying inequity in hiring practices, which is particularly notable in the English language teaching industry. Thank you.
Great, thank you, all three of you, for that presentation. We'd like to open it up to questions. If you have a question, you are more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it into the chat and I am happy to relay it. So we'll open up for questions.
Hey, would you like me to stop the screen share so that we can see everybody? Would that be better?
Sure, let's do that. Yeah. Any questions from the group?
Part of what's so exciting to me about these findings is that people generally intuitively aren't very surprised that, you know, a listener would pay more attention to a teacher than they would to a student. So it doesn't seem surprising, but being so from in linguistic theory, it's been very traditional to abstract away all of these kinds of social judgments and just describe the process of sound learning in these very, like in terms of the acoustics, et cetera, and to assume sort of an idealized, neutral, objective subject. And so it's been very interesting as I've developed this line of research to see how differently people in different fields react to it, because linguists tend to find this much more surprising than, say, English teachers or just lay people in general. So I'm really excited about it, but I often get this sort of silence when I present work in this vein, because it doesn't seem terribly surprising to think that people are using their social knowledge to guide their linguistic attention, and yet before this, that it hasn't been accounted for in linguistic theory. So here we've shown that this effect holds for adults in a second language learning environment. But I also have work trying to show that this kind of process is active throughout the lifespan, and that even infants are already using social weighting to guide their attention to a different acoustics.
Right, we've got a question in the chat. Based on these results, what suggestions would you have for language teachers at the moment of implementing listening and pronunciation instruction?
I'm having unmuting issues. I love this question because I love to be challenged by such questions, right? So what we have here is some basic science in a very abstracted setting. But I think what this really does is reinforce what teachers, I'm assuming many already knew, as Alaya was pointing out, that the biases that we hold, right, follow us into the classroom, and these affect learning, right? So I've been imagining, like, how would you incorporate this knowledge into language teaching? I mean, in some ways, I think it's super just validating, right? But in another sense, I think it brings up an opportunity to actually have conversations with students about whose input is considered more and less valuable, and importantly, why. what we've been able to show here is that, biases about who's likely to have authority with respect to pronunciation in a classroom, reflect these traditional roles of teachers versus students. And that seems like a really reasonable thing to do. However, it gets very complicated and very problematic when we start to think about how individuals are racialized in these contexts, and in particular in English language teaching, where there can often be an ideology of preference for native speakers, and assumptions about what a native speaker should look like, and whether their speech is likely to provide information about the pronunciation of the language that a student finds valuable. It gets really complicated and really interesting. And so I think this helps. I mean, I hope what we're doing is helping to kind of uncover this, right? And this is a brand new methodology. And we're hoping now that we have some materials that give us some pretty robust effects, we can actually start to look into maybe some more interesting questions that can have more immediately obvious applications in language teaching. What do you think, Josh?
Sorry, I was muted. No, I was thinking about the same, something about along the same lines, and maybe the issue of exposing learners to a high variability phonetic training, for example, in order to make all this type of input available.
All right, we've got another question. Why did you choose to test with an artificial language instead of an unfamiliar real language?
Kathleen, this question is kind of related to the one that was just asked. It would seem like we would be much closer to being able to inform what to do in the classroom if we actually conducted this research in the classroom context. But we're coming at it as basic scientists and building on a literature that had looked at these subphonemic differences. And while individuals produce those, we can produce these differences. We aren't actually very good at controlling that as precisely as we did in the initial two studies. And so being able to do that in the classroom with an unfamiliar language would be kind of tricky. So it really has to do with the literature that we're building on and just showing that these patterns, that these findings exist. With that third study where we look at phonemic differences, so the SEZA distinction in English, now we really have more flexibility, right? There we do actually have that inner speaker, the within speaker variability that we were talking about. And we also have the distinction between speakers, and English speakers in those cases could pretty readily, it's not hard for me to say sago versus zago and know that I'm producing that in a way that a listener is with an English background is going to also perceive that as sago and zago. So now we're in a position where we're looking at a type of contrast that we could actually look at in a classroom environment. So some other factors that are going on in the actual classroom setting that we don't yet understand, including like what happens when there's real people present in the classroom as opposed to these little bean people that we had in the study. So we need to keep inching towards being more ecologically valid, right? Looking at the classroom setting, but we have to do it little by little so we can keep understanding what the new factor that we're introducing is actually telling us about the learning process, and in particular about the social perception.
Right, because as intuitive as the results may seem, that learners would attend more to use these social cues to attend more to certain talkers when they're learning phonetics, there's been no such finding published before. And so we're building on a literature which shows that without actually, in an ostensibly socially neutral environment, how like these highly regimented sound contrasts can be tracked by listeners. And so using the artificial language lets us really highly control all of the variability between sounds in a tradition that's consistent with the asocial work that's come before. So now that we've established that using this artificial language and these very closely manipulated acoustic differences, that we can get this effect that allow us to move in a more naturalistic direction.
I'd like to add that, figuring out how this wonderfully messy world we live in works takes a village. And one of the opportunities that's most exciting about getting to talk with different groups is putting these things out there and having people like maybe Kathleen is thinking like, why would they do it that way? I would do it this other way, right? And then maybe pursue that, right? And take this work where we've done effectively so far like a proof of concept, right? Like what we have here is like there's this effect and we can extract it from the world under super controlled conditions. And the question is, when we move out into a more ecologically valid setting, do these effects hold? We could predict they would, but as we've noted, the real world is a lot messier than an artificial language, right?
I had a question, if there aren't others coming up. At test, they were asked which pronunciation was best or which one they preferred, correct? Do you think there would be a difference if it was to match up based on what was correct to, like the picture and the auditory were matched up as correct versus incorrect, if there would be greater overall proportion of responses saying that the teacher's version was correct versus incorrect compared to what the student's version of that auditory token would be? That makes sense.
Are you suggesting like a different proportion of the items during the exposure phase?
It would end up being that way, yes. So I'm just thinking if that preference, if the preference the specific preference to teacher or student was kind of blinded more, and it was just which version is correct, if the listeners would end up choosing the teacher tokens as correct more often than the student tokens, even if it was technically correct both of those times.
So because we counterbalanced, I think not. So what we did was in some conditions, the teacher produced long and the student short, and in others, the teacher produced short and the student long. What we got is the same effect, right? An attraction to the phonetics that came out of the purported teacher's mouth, right? Is that answering your question? Okay, so you were trying to figure out if there was like a preferred phonetics.
Yeah, if that preference was stronger than what the actual information or input that they were getting was.
No, although I guess we could get a little bit of information about that looking at the two control conditions. Did they overall just like long VOT at test better than short? I'm not sure how those ended up looking, but no, so in counterbalancing, we removed that as an explanation. Yeah, I mean, and to come back to what's so interesting about this to us is like the fact that like there's plenty of work done where what we do is expose learners to some sounds and then they behave differently after having been exposed to those sounds, right? But what we haven't done before is ask whether they can differentially be affected by sounds depending on who they think's producing them. I mean, I think it's really important. Like I'm amazed over and over, right? Like I think the world works this way. And then I look at this data and I go, yeah, that is so exciting because they're getting in all of these conditions, they're getting exactly the same auditory input, right? The only difference is whether they think some of the tokens are from a teacher and others, which ones are associated with a teacher and which ones associated with a student. And so all of this like statistical learning models that we have, or anything we're, any of the models we have where we're trying to explain acquisition from exposure to acoustic events isn't enough, right? Like now we know that it's not simply exposure to acoustic events. It's exposure to acoustic events as moderated by some other stuff, right? By how valuable they think any given acoustic event is likely to be. I don't know, are the people who are language teachers, like, are they thinking things like, I mean, in communicative language teaching, right? Like, what we do is we have a lot of students communicating with each other too, right? Interaction in classrooms. And I think it begs a lot of questions about what students think they're learning from different people. I don't know how teachers handle that.
Any other final comments or questions from our group? All right, then with that, we'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar, the social weighting of L2 speech input. I want to give a special thank you to our presenters, Drs. Hayes-Harb, Barrios, and Tripp. And with that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar for today. Thank you everyone for joining us.